The night was electric with tension, the kind that makes even the air feel heavy. Cameras flashed, lights blazed, and millions of eyes were locked onto their screens as Senators Cory Booker and John Kennedy took their seats across from each other on live television. It was supposed to be a simple policy debate, but everyone could sense that something deeper was brewing beneath the surface. Booker, always passionate and fiery, came ready to dominate the stage. Kennedy, calm and folksy, sat with his trademark grin that masked a sharp wit and unshakable confidence. When the moderator asked about leadership and moral courage, Booker leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "Let's be honest," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Some people here mistake charm for wisdom. We need leaders who build bridges, not folksy storytellers who hide behind cliches." The audience gasped. Kennedy's smile faded, replaced by a quiet, measured stare that said more than words ever could. Booker didn't stop there. He pressed on, his tone growing sharper, more personal. "America deserves authenticity," he continued. "Not a man who quotes country sayings while voting against the people he claims to represent." The audience murmured, torn between discomfort and intrigue. Kennedy shifted slightly in his chair but said nothing. The camera zoomed in on his face, revealing the faint tightening of his jaw. Booker's words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. For a moment, it seemed as though Kennedy had been cornered, publicly humiliated before a national audience. Social media erupted. Clips of the exchange flooded feeds, with pundits praising Booker's boldness and calling Kennedy outdated. But behind the scenes, something deeper was stirring in Kennedy, a resolve born not of anger, but of reflection and quiet strength. Later that night, Kennedy sat alone in his office, the lights dimmed, a single cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He replayed the debate in his mind, each word like a stone thrown against his chest. He wasn't angry at Booker. No, anger would have been easy. He was disappointed, not in the insult, but in what it revealed, a nation losing sight of grace. His father's words echoed in his memory. "Son, a man's dignity isn't in how he speaks when he's winning. It's in how he speaks when he's been wronged." Kennedy leaned back in his chair and sighed. He knew what he had to do. Tomorrow he would speak, not to defend himself, but to remind people, and perhaps Booker most of all, what true leadership looked like. He began to write, slowly at first, then with growing conviction. His pen glided across the paper as the words poured straight from his heart. The next day, the Senate chamber was packed. Reporters lined the walls and cameras pointed toward the podium where Kennedy stood, papers in hand. The nation watched, waiting for him to retaliate. But when he began to speak, his tone was soft, almost tender. "Yesterday," he said, "I was called a lot of things on television. Some of it stung, I'll admit, but I learned long ago that you can't grow a rose without a few thorns." The room fell silent. He looked up, his eyes steady and filled with empathy. I don't blame my colleague for his words. Passion can cloud kindness, and we all forget sometimes that disagreement doesn't make us enemies. Booker sat in the back row, his face unreadable. But his eyes flickered with something, perhaps discomfort, perhaps guilt. Kennedy continued, "This nation doesn't need perfect men. It needs men willing to forgive, to listen, and to stand even when mocked for standing." His speech deepened, touching on stories of hardship, humility, and hope. He spoke of his upbringing in a small Louisiana town where neighbors disagreed often but still broke bread together at the same table. He spoke of veterans, single mothers, and struggling farmers, people who didn't need politicians to shout for them, but to stand beside them. His voice cracked when he said, "I'd rather be mocked for speaking gently than praised for shouting the loudest." The audience was utterly still. Every word felt like a balm on the raw wounds of division that had spread far beyond the Senate floor. For the first time, the insults of the previous night seemed small, almost childish, in comparison to the grace unfolding before them. As the final words left Kennedy's lips, there was no thunderous applause, only a deep, reverent silence. Then slowly people began to stand. One by one, senators, reporters, even staffers rose to their feet in quiet respect. Booker remained seated for a moment, frozen, his mind replaying every cutting word he'd spoken. He had meant to challenge Kennedy, to expose what he saw as weakness. But now he saw something else, something he had overlooked entirely. Kennedy's strength wasn't in his clever lines or his country charm. It was in his unwavering decency. Booker felt a lump rise in his throat, and for the first time in his public life, he felt ashamed not because he'd lost an argument, but because he'd lost himself in it. After the session ended, Booker found himself standing outside Kennedy's office, hesitating. His hand hovered over the door handle before he finally knocked. Kennedy looked up from his desk, a warm smile breaking across his face. "Senator Booker," he said, his tone free of resentment. "Come on in." Booker took a deep breath and stepped inside. "John," he began softly, "I owe you an apology." "I was wrong." "I thought strength was about volume, but you reminded me it's about grace." Kennedy nodded, motioning for him to sit. "We all forget that sometimes," he replied gently. "But the good thing about a new day is, it gives us another chance to remember." For a moment, two men from different worlds simply sat together, not as rivals, but as human beings who had learned from each other. News of their private meeting spread quickly, though neither man spoke publicly about what was said. What the world did see, however, was a change, subtle but profound. In the weeks that followed, Booker's speeches carried a different tone. The fire was still there, but now it burned with purpose, not pride. Kennedy, too, became a symbol of quiet integrity, his words replayed in classrooms and Sunday sermons across the country. Their unlikely reconciliation became a story that transcended politics, reminding people that even in a divided world, humility still has the power to heal. Months later, at a public event on unity and civic grace, Booker took the stage and shared a story about the man who taught him the meaning of true strength. "He didn't raise his voice," Booker said, smiling, "but somehow his words echoed louder than mine ever did." In the audience, Kennedy watched with misty eyes, his heart full. The applause that followed wasn't for a single man. It was for the rare moment when humanity triumphed over ego. People left that night feeling lighter, inspired, and perhaps a little more hopeful about the country they all shared. Years later, when both men had long since retired, their story continued to circulate. A story not of rivalry, but of redemption. It was told in schools, quoted in sermons, and shared on social media as a reminder of what can happen when humility meets forgiveness. And somewhere in the deep, quiet corners of memory, that night on live TV faded into insignificance. What remained was the legacy of two men who learned that sometimes the most powerful victories don't happen in debates or headlines. They happen in the heart. By the end, what began as an insult had become an inspiration. Proof that even the fiercest words can lead to the softest truths. Kennedy's grace had turned humiliation into healing, and Booker's humility had transformed regret into growth. The story of their clash and reconciliation stood as a timeless lesson, that the truest strength isn't found in the power to wound, but in the courage to forgive and in the wisdom to rise above.